Niafe was born into a life of comfort, wrapped in love and luxury in Banjaro village. Her father, Jabari, adored her, and her mother filled their home with warmth. But happiness is fragile. When Niafe was 5, tragedy struck. Her mother passed away, leaving a hole in their lives. Jabari, lost in grief, sought comfort in another woman. That woman was Bokani. At first, Bokani was gentle, speaking in soft tones and showering Niafe with fake kindness. She played the role of a perfect wife, making Jabari believe she was the best thing to happen to their family. But the moment she secured her place, her mask slipped. Sweet words turned into sharp orders, and kind gestures became cruel punishments. Niafe was no longer the cherished daughter of the house. She was now a servant in her own home. The moment Bokani tightened her grip on the household, Niafe's life became a living nightmare. Gone were the days of warmth and laughter. Instead, her world was now filled with endless chores, cruel words, and the heavy weight of exhaustion. Bokani treated her like a worthless servant, barking orders from morning to night, while Bokani's own daughters lounged around in silk dresses, eating the finest meals and living like royalty. Niafe scrubbed floors until her fingers bled. She fetched water under the scorching sun, washed piles of clothes that weren't even hers, and cooked feasts she wasn't allowed to taste. If she ever paused for a moment, Bokani's sharp voice would cut through the air. "Lazy girl, do you think you deserve to rest?" But the cruelty didn't stop there. Bokani didn't just want Niafe to work. She wanted to erase every trace of her past life. She snatched away Niafe's beautiful dresses and replaced them with rags that barely covered her body. "You're nothing now," she sneered, tossing the fine fabrics into a chest for her own daughters to wear. A beggar should look like a beggar. Jabari, the man who once held Niafe in his arms and promised to protect her, was now blind to her suffering. Love had turned him into a fool. Whenever Niafe tried to speak up, Bokani would put on her act, shedding fake tears and twisting the truth. "She's just struggling to adjust," she would say, dabbing at her dry eyes. "I'm only trying to teach her discipline." Jabari, desperate to keep peace in his new marriage, would nod and turn away. He never questioned why his daughter, once bright and full of life, now walked with her head down, her shoulders hunched under the weight of misery. He never noticed the bruises hidden beneath her sleeves, or the hunger in her eyes when she watched others eat. Bokani, knowing there was no one to stop her, grew bolder in her cruelty. She found joy in making Niafe's life as unbearable as possible. If the chores weren't done to her satisfaction, she would throw food on the floor and make Niafe clean it up again. If Niafe finished her work early, Bokani would find new ways to keep her busy, polishing the same floor twice, washing clothes that were already clean, or standing in the sun just to learn patience. But the worst part wasn't the work, it was the humiliation. Bokani made sure Niafe knew she was beneath everyone else in the house. Her daughters sneered at her, laughing as they paraded around in her stolen dresses, their stomachs full, while Niafe's growled with hunger. "Why are you so dirty, Niafe?" they would mock. "Oh wait, you're just a little rat now." At night, when everyone else was asleep in their soft beds, Niafe curled up on a thin mat in the coldest corner of the house. Tears burned her eyes, but she forced herself not to cry. Crying wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't make her father see the truth. It wouldn't make Bokani less cruel. It wouldn't bring her mother back. So she swallowed her pain, just like she swallowed the stale bread Bokani threw at her. She told herself to survive, to endure, because deep down, no matter how much they tried to break her, a fire still burned inside her, and one day, they would all regret treating her like nothing. Bokani's cruelty knew no limits, but even Niafe never imagined she would one day be treated worse than an animal. It started with small humiliations, being given the cold leftovers no one wanted, being forced to eat in the corner, while the rest of the family dined at the grand table. But one night, Bokani took things to a level so cruel, it left even the servants whispering in shock. Dinner was served, a feast of roasted meat, fresh bread, and steaming stew. The rich aroma filled the house as Bokani and her daughters sat comfortably, laughing and eating to their heart's content. Niafe stood nearby, stomach twisting in hunger, waiting for the usual leftovers. But that night, Bokani had something else in mind. She took a bowl, the same one used to feed the dogs, and scooped a handful of scraps into it. The bones, the fat, the chewed-up bits her daughters had spat out. Then, with a smirk, she set the bowl outside on the dirt floor. "If you're hungry, eat," she said. her voice dripping with fake kindness. Or do you think you deserve better? Niafe froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as her stepsisters burst into laughter. Go on, little dog, one of them taunted, throwing a piece of bread onto the ground like she was feeding a stray. Aren't you hungry? Hunger clawed at Niafe's stomach, but her pride screamed louder. She wanted to refuse, to stand tall and fight back. But the truth was, she hadn't eaten all day. If she didn't eat now, she wouldn't have the strength to wake up and do the endless chores waiting for her. Trembling, she stepped outside. The cold night air bit at her skin as she stared at the bowl on the ground. It wasn't just food, it was a test, a punishment, a message that she was nothing in this house. Her throat tightened, tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. With slow, shaky hands, she reached for the bowl. Laughter exploded behind her. Her stepsisters were watching from the doorway, pointing and howling with joy at her misery. One of them picked up a piece of meat and tossed it at her feet. Oops! Looks like you missed a piece, little mutt. The humiliation crushed her, but she swallowed it down just as she swallowed the dry, tasteless food. She forced herself to eat, to endure, to survive. Bokani had stripped her of everything, her clothes, her comfort, her dignity. But Niafe still had one thing left, hope. As she chewed on the scraps meant for dogs, she made a silent promise to herself. This wasn't the end. One day, the same people who laughed at her would choke on their laughter. One day, the woman eating from a dog's bowl would rise so high that even Bokani would have to bow. And on that day, she would make them regret every single moment they made her suffer. Niafe sat behind the house, knees pulled to her chest, silent tears carving paths down her dirt-streaked face. She had learned to cry without making a sound. If Bokani heard, it would only bring more punishment. Her stomach growled, still aching from last night's humiliation, when she had been forced to eat from the dog's bowl like a stray. The laughter of her stepsisters still echoed in her mind, a cruel reminder of how powerless she was. She clenched her fists, pressing them into the cold ground. Was this her life now? A servant in her own home? A girl treated worse than an animal? Lost in her thoughts, she didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching until a voice, low and knowing, cut through the silence. Tears won't change your fate, child. Niafe's head snapped up. An old woman stood before her, wrapped in a tattered shawl, her silver hair glinting under the fading sunlight. Her dark eyes held something strange, something deeper than pity. It was as if she could see right into Niafe's soul. Niafe quickly wiped her face and straightened up, wary of the stranger. No one ever came to this side of the house. Who are you? She whispered. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she crouched down, leveling her gaze with Niafe's. I've seen many like you before, she murmured. Beaten, broken, tossed aside like they are nothing. Her voice carried the weight of untold stories, of wisdom earned through pain. Niafe swallowed hard, looking away. She didn't want to hear words of sympathy. She didn't want another reminder of how miserable her life had become. But then, the old woman spoke again. This time, her words sent a shiver down Niafe's spine. One day, the one who humbles you will kneel before you. Niafe's breath caught. She turned sharply to look at the woman, searching her face for any hint of mockery. But the woman's expression was unreadable, her eyes steady, as if she had just spoken a prophecy. What do you mean? Niafe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman only smiled, as if she had already said all that needed to be said. She reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out a small piece of bread, placing it gently in Niafe's hands. For strength, she said, you'll need it. And then, just as mysteriously as she had appeared, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the thick trees at the edge of the village. Niafe sat frozen, staring down at the bread in her hands, the words repeated in her head, over and over. The one who humbles you will kneel before you. She didn't fully understand them, not yet, but something about them sparked a fire deep inside her, a fire that had been buried under years of cruelty and humiliation. For the first time in a long time, Niafe allowed herself to believe in something bigger than her suffering. She didn't know how, she didn't know when, but one day she would rise. And when that day came, Bokani would regret ever treating her like nothing. The night was thick with silence, the kind that made even the wind hold its breath. Inside the grand house that once felt like home, Niafe sat on the cold floor of her tiny room, heart pounding in her chest. Tomorrow, she would no longer be a prisoner in this house. She would be sold. She had overheard Bokani's cruel laughter earlier that day. boasting about how much money she would make from marrying Niafe off to an old, cruel man in a neighboring village. A man known for breaking his wives like wild animals, a man who had already buried 3. Niafe clenched her fist so hard her nails dug into her skin. She refused. She had endured years of Bokani's cruelty, years of eating from a dog's bowl, years of suffering in silence. But she would not be sold like livestock. As the house slept, she paced, mind racing. She needed a way out. But how? The gates were locked, and Bokani's guards would kill her if they caught her trying to escape. Despair threatened to choke her, until a faint knock at her window made her freeze. Slowly, she turned, and there, standing in the shadows, was Sulwe. The old woman's eyes glowed in the moonlight, her presence almost ghostly. "It's time," she whispered. Niafe rushed to the window, desperation clashing with hope. "How?" she breathed. Sulwe held up a small knife and a thick cloth. Quietly, without hesitation, Niafe climbed out of the window, her bare feet hitting the cool earth. The moment she touched the ground, Sulwe grabbed her hand and pulled her into the darkness. They moved fast, ducking behind trees and slipping past the sleeping guards. Sulwe led her toward the back gate, where a single guard stood, half asleep with a spear resting against his shoulder. Niafe's pulse hammered as Sulwe crept up behind him, swift as a shadow. With practiced ease, she pressed the cloth over his face. The man struggled for a few seconds before his body slumped to the ground. Niafe stared in shock. "What was that?" she whispered. "Sleep powder," Sulwe muttered, already pulling Niafe through the gate. "Move!" Niafe didn't ask questions. She ran. The forest swallowed them whole, its towering trees casting eerie shadows under the moonlight. Twigs snapped beneath their feet as they weaved through the thick undergrowth. Every rustle, every distant howl of an animal sent a jolt of fear through Niafe's veins. She didn't dare look back. They ran for what felt like hours, until finally, the trees thinned, revealing a dirt path leading toward the unknown. Sulwe stopped, breathless but steady. "This road leads to Lumora City," she said. "Follow it, and don't look back." Niafe's chest rose and fell in sharp gasps. "You're not coming?" Sulwe shook her head. "My journey ends here. Yours is just beginning." Fear gripped Niafe's heart. The only world she knew was behind her, and the future before her was nothing but uncertainty. "What if I don't make it?" Sulwe stepped closer, gripping her shoulders. "Listen to me, child. You are not weak. You were never weak. You've been surviving in a cage for years. Now, you will thrive in freedom." Niafe swallowed hard. The words felt impossible to believe, but deep inside, a spark of something unfamiliar stirred. Was it hope? Sulwe placed something in her hands, a small, wrapped bundle. "Food for the road. And this." She pulled out a silver chain from her pocket, pressing it into Niafe's palm. "For luck." Niafe's fingers curled around it. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. Sulwe smiled, her eyes warm, yet sad. "One day, the one who humbles you will kneel before you." The words sent a shiver down Niafe's spine. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she would survive the journey. But she knew one thing. She would never be caged again. With one final look at the woman who had saved her, she turned and ran. She ran toward a future she couldn't see, toward freedom, toward Lumora. The streets of Lumora were nothing like Banjaro village. The air buzzed with the scent of roasted spices. Merchants shouted over each other, and gold coins clinked in the hands of the rich. But for Niafe, it was a battlefield. She had arrived with nothing. No family, no money, just a fire in her heart and a hunger to survive. For days, she wandered the streets, searching for food, shelter, anything that could keep her alive. People looked past her like she was invisible. Some sneered, others pitied, but no one helped. Until she met him. Mosi was not like the others. He was a merchant, a man who had built his wealth from nothing. He had sharp eyes that saw things others missed. And when he saw Niafe, he didn't see a beggar. He saw potential. She had been lingering outside his shop, watching as his workers loaded crates of silk and spices. "You look like someone who doesn't give up easily," he said, stepping toward her. "Are you looking for work?" Niafe's stomach growled, but she held her head high. "I'll do anything," he smirked. "Then prove it." The next morning, she arrived before sunrise. Mosi gave her small tasks, sorting fabrics, keeping records, running errands. But Niafe didn't just work. She observed. She memorized how Mosi negotiated, how he controlled his buyers, how he turned simple goods into wealth. Within months, she wasn't just another worker. She was Mosey's most trusted assistant, and within years, she was more than that. By the time she turned 22, the girl who once ate from a dog's bowl was unrecognizable. She wore silk, not rags. She owned gold, not dust. And most importantly, she ruled. Niafe didn't just work under Mosey, she built her own empire. She started trading spices, then fabrics, then rare gems. Every deal she made, every risk she took, turned to gold in her hands. People in Lumora whispered her name, some in fear, some in admiration. The same streets that once ignored her now bowed before her. One evening, as she stood on the balcony of her grand estate, watching the city that had shaped her, she thought about the past, about Bokani, about the cruelty, the humiliation, and for the first time in years, she smiled, because she knew the woman who once made her eat like a dog would soon come crawling. Bokani once walked through Banjaro village with her chin high, her gold bracelets clinking as she flaunted her wealth. She had everything, servants to do her bidding, daughters dressed in the finest fabrics, and a husband too blind with love to question her cruelty. She had won, or so she thought, but time has a way of humbling the arrogant. Her daughters, spoiled beyond repair, saw money as endless. They spent without care, throwing extravagant feasts, buying jewelry they didn't need, and turning away anyone who dared speak of limits. Bokani had raised them to believe they were queens, but queens without wisdom destroy their own kingdoms. Soon, the gold was gone, the servants left, the fine clothes faded, replaced by patched rags. And then came the worst blow. Jabari, the husband who had once given her everything, fell sick. At first, Bokani ignored it. She had always controlled him, and she believed she could control this too. But sickness does not listen to orders, and medicine does not come for free. She searched the house for something, anything, of value to sell, but there was nothing left. The house that once echoed with laughter and luxury now held only silence. Hunger gnawed at her daughters, their once perfect faces now hollow. The same people Bokani had looked down on now walked past her, offering nothing but pity. Pity. Bokani hated pity, but she hated starvation more. One morning, as she sat outside her crumbling house, listening to her daughters cry over empty plates, she heard a name whispered with reverence. Niafe. Her heart nearly stopped. Could it be? The same girl she had humiliated, beaten, and tossed aside? The same girl she had forced to eat from the dog's bowl? Impossible. But the villagers spoke of a woman in Lumora, a woman of power, a woman who had risen from the dirt to become untouchable. They said she helped the poor, that she gave food to the hungry. Bokani's stomach twisted. She had spent her life crushing others beneath her feet. Now, she was the one crawling. But desperation silences pride. That night, she gathered what little she had and set out for Lumora. The journey was brutal. She walked for miles, her once delicate feet bleeding against the rough road. The heat burned her skin, the cold bit into her bones. But she kept going. She had to. Because if the rumors were true, if Niafe really had become powerful, then maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to survive. She had no idea that her greatest nightmare was waiting for her at the end of the road. The streets of Lumora were nothing like Banjaro village. The air was thick with the scent of roasted spices, the clinking of gold coins, and the murmur of deals being made. Bokani had never felt so small. She had once walked with power, her steps heavy with pride. Now, she shuffled through the dust like a shadow of herself, her clothes torn, her stomach empty, and her daughters trailing behind, weak and silent. The rumors had led her here. A woman, they said, a woman who had risen from nothing, a queen without a crown. She fed the hungry, clothed the poor, and built an empire out of dust. Bokani clung to those whispers like a dying man clings to air. She never expected the journey to be so cruel. Days of walking had left her feet raw, her throat parched, hunger clawed at her ribs. Her daughters, once pampered beyond reason, now knew the taste of suffering. The same girls who had once laughed as their stepsister ate from a dog's bowl now cried for a crumb of bread. Bokani ignored their tears. There was only one thought in her mind: find the woman in gold. She reached the gates of a grand palace, a place so magnificent that it made her old home look like a beggar's hut. People lined up outside, some in rags, others in fine silk, all hoping for a moment with the woman who ruled Lumora's markets. Bokani joined the line, her heart pounding. Every step forward felt like a lifetime. Sweat dripped down her face. Her body trembled, but she held on. And then, finally, it was her turn. The gate swung open, revealing a hall draped in riches beyond imagination. And at the center of it, all stood her, Niafe. For a moment, Bokani couldn't breathe. The girl she had humiliated, starved, and cast aside stood before her, dressed in flowing silk embroidered with gold, her fingers adorned with rings that sparkled like fire. Her face, once pale and weary, now radiated power. She was not the beaten child Bokani had tormented. She was a ruler, a force, a woman who had taken the world in her hands and bent it to her will. Bokani dropped to her knees. Please, help me," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Niafe tilted her head, studying the woman who had once treated her worse than an animal. Bokani's daughters clung to her, their once arrogant eyes filled with fear. For the first time in her life, Bokani felt what it was like to be nothing. The room was silent, and then Niafe laughed. Bokani knelt on the cold marble floor, her body trembling as she looked up at the woman she had once tormented. The sight before her was unbearable. Niafe, the same girl she had starved, mocked, and treated worse than an animal, now stood above her, draped in silk and gold, her presence commanding the entire room. Bokani's lips quivered as she tried to speak, but the words refused to come. The air around her felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of her past sins. Niafe stepped forward, her golden heels clicking against the floor with a sharp, deliberate rhythm. She towered over Bokani, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, those eyes burned with something that sent a shiver down Bokani's spine. "Look at you," Niafe finally spoke, her voice smooth, calm, too calm, once so powerful, so proud, and now she let the silence stretch, her gaze slowly scanning Bokani's tattered clothes, her hollowed cheeks, her daughters cowering behind her. "Now you kneel." Bokani's throat tightened. "Niafe, please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I have nothing left. My daughters, they are starving. My husband is gone. I have no home, no money. I have lost everything." Niafe let out a small hum, tilting her head. "Everything." She let the word roll off her tongue, as if tasting it. "No, Bokani, I lost everything first." She took another step forward. "Do you remember? How you made me scrub floors until my hands bled? How you stripped me of my clothes, my dignity? How you laughed as your daughters threw food on the ground, forcing me to eat like a dog?" Bokani squeezed her eyes shut. She did remember. Every single moment. She remembered the way Niafe had trembled in the cold, the way she had swallowed her tears along with the dirt-covered scraps, the way she had once looked at her with silent, burning hatred. "You made me eat like a dog," Niafe continued, her voice sharper now. "And now, you beg like one." Bokani opened her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she understood the meaning of true fear. Niafe turned to her guards, her lips curling into a smirk. "Feed them," she commanded. A flicker of hope sparked in Bokani's chest. Was Niafe truly sparing them? Then the guards returned, with a dog's bowl. They placed it in front of Bokani, filled with food, rich, steaming food, but in a vessel meant for animals. The message was clear. Bokani's breath hitched. Her daughters gasped behind her. Shame burned through her like fire, her hands shaking as she stared at the bowl. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to scream, but her stomach growled, her body weak from days without food. The scent of the meal was overwhelming, taunting. Niafe crouched down, her voice a whisper only Bokani could hear. "Eat." Bokani looked up at her, her vision blurred with unshed tears. Niafe held her gaze, waiting. The moment stretched. The entire room watched. And then, slowly, painfully, Bokani reached for the bowl. Her fingers trembled as she picked up a piece of food, her pride shattering with every movement. The woman who had once ruled over a house, who had once forced another to eat from the ground, was now reduced to the very thing she had mocked. Niafe watched in silence, and then, just as Bokani lifted the food to her lips, Niafe spoke again. "Stop." Bokani froze. Niafe stood up, her expression unreadable. "Take it away." The guards removed the bowl. Bokani's hands fell to her lap, her body shaking. "I don't need revenge," Niafe said, her voice softer now, "because you've already lost. Your punishment isn't eating from a dog's bowl, Bokani." She leaned in, her golden eyes piercing through her. "Your punishment is knowing that I am the one who decides whether you eat at all." Bokani's face crumpled. Niafe straightened, turning to her guards. "Give them proper food," she ordered, "and then send them on their way." Bokani lifted her head in shock. "Go," Niafe said, Live with what you've done. That is the real price you pay. Bokani clutched her chest, gasping for air as the realization sank in. She had not only lost her wealth, her home, and her status. She had lost to Niafe, and there was no deeper humiliation than that. Bokani ran through the streets of Lumora, her breath ragged, her legs weak. People turned to stare at the once proud woman, now reduced to nothing but a beggar in rags. She didn't care. She just needed to escape the weight of her own downfall, escape the truth that had finally caught up with her. Her daughters trailed behind, sobbing, clutching their empty stomachs. But Bokani couldn't comfort them. She couldn't even look at them, because she knew she had done this to herself. All the cruelty, all the greed, all the years of stepping on others had led her here, to the very place she had never imagined she would be, a nobody. As she collapsed onto the cold stone steps of a deserted alley, her mind echoed with Niafe's words. Your punishment is knowing that I am the one who decides whether you eat at all. Bokani buried her face in her hands. Karma. She had laughed at it once, thought she was untouchable, thought she could do as she pleased, and the world would always bend in her favor. But karma wasn't a myth, it was real, and now it had come for her. Meanwhile, in the heart of Lumora, Niafe stood tall. She watched as the beggars outside her palace were fed, clothed, and given shelter. She didn't ask for their names. She didn't ask for their pasts. She just helped, because she knew what it was like to be starving, to be thrown aside like nothing. But unlike Bokani, she had not let her suffering turn her into a monster. She had risen above it. She had built an empire, not on greed, but on strength, not on cruelty, but on resilience. And now, she was more than just the girl who had once been forced to eat from a dog's bowl. She was a symbol that those who are trampled today will rise tomorrow, that power shifts, that fate changes, that no one stays at the bottom forever. As the sun set over Lumora, casting a golden glow over the city, Niafe stood at the balcony of her palace, watching the world she had built. And in that moment, she knew she had won. Life always comes full circle. Niafe rose, and Bokani fell. Karma never forgets. What would you have done in her place? Comment below, and if you love stories of justice and revenge, tap on the videos on your screen, because the best is yet to come.